Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And please, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. All right, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we'll explore a case that shook Colorado and captivated the nation. The tragic murder of 11-year-old Gannon Stotch. This is a story of betrayal, deception, and ultimately, justice served. So as we settle in, let me take you through this haunting tale. It was January 27th, 2020, a cold Monday evening in Colorado Springs. The Lorson Ranch neighborhood was quiet, filled with middle-class families who chose this area for its safety and community feel. At 6:55 p.m., a call came into the El Paso County Sheriff's Office dispatch. The caller reported a runaway child, 11-year-old Gannon Stotch, was missing from his home on Mandan Drive. Gannon was described as a bright, energetic boy with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Born on September 29, 2008, he was the kind of child who brought light into every room he entered. His father, Al Stotch, was deployed overseas with the National Guard at the time, leaving Gannon in the care of his stepmother, Letitia Stotch. Letitia told investigators that Gannon had left the house that afternoon around 3:15 p.m. to visit a friend down the street, but he never came home. She painted herself as a worried stepmother, frantically searching the neighborhood and calling his name. By 7:32 p.m. that evening, Gannon's information was entered into state and national databases as an active runaway. But something about Letitia's story didn't sit right with the investigators who responded that night. Her demeanor seemed off, too calm for a woman whose stepchild had vanished into the cold Colorado evening. The temperature was dropping, and an 11-year-old boy was somewhere out in the darkness, presumably alone and vulnerable. The next morning, January 28th, the case was turned over to investigators within the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. What began as a missing child case would soon transform into something much more sinister. Detectives started conducting interviews, collecting surveillance footage from the neighborhood, and following up on leads. Within 48 hours, the case was upgraded. This was no longer being treated as a simple runaway situation. The evidence was pointing towards something far worse: a child in danger, possibly the victim of foul play. The community rallied together in those early days. Volunteers scoured the area around Lorson Ranch, searching through parks, wooded areas, and anywhere an 11-year-old boy might seek shelter. Search and rescue teams combed the terrain with dogs and specialized equipment. The story began making local news, and soon, Gannon's face was everywhere, on missing person flyers, social media posts, and television screens across Colorado. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Where was Gannon Stotch? What had happened to this innocent child on that cold January afternoon? Letitia Stotch quickly became the focus of media attention as Gannon's primary caregiver during his disappearance. She gave interviews to local news stations, always maintaining the same story: Gannon had left the house to visit a friend and simply never returned home. But investigators were noticing inconsistencies in her accounts. During recorded phone calls with Gannon's father, Al Stotch, who was desperately trying to get information from overseas, Letitia's story began to change. Details shifted, timelines altered, and new elements were introduced that hadn't been there before. Al Stotch would later testify in court about these conversations, fighting back tears as he described his growing realization that something was terribly wrong. This was the woman he had trusted with his son's care, the woman he had married and welcomed into their family. Now, listening to her contradictory explanations, he began to suspect the unthinkable. The investigators were building their case methodically. They were examining every aspect of Letitia's story, checking security cameras throughout the neighborhood, and interviewing anyone who might have seen Gannon that day. What they discovered would paint a horrifying picture of betrayal and violence. As February progressed with no sign of Gannon, law enforcement was quietly gathering evidence that would ultimately seal Letitia Stotch's fate. They had obtained search warrants for the family home and were conducting forensic examinations of the property. What they found in Gannon's bedroom would haunt the investigators forever. There was enough blood that it had soaked through the carpet and into the padding beneath. This wasn't the result of a small accident or minor injury. This was evidence of violence, serious violence that had occurred in the very room where an 11-year-old boy should have been safe. The blood spatter patterns told a story that contradicted everything Letitia had claimed. Forensic experts would later determine that this was where they believed Gannon had been killed, in his own bedroom, on the very day Letitia claimed he had run away. But the evidence didn't stop there. Investigators were also examining Letitia's vehicle, a SUV that would become central to their case. They discovered additional blood evidence in the cargo area, suggesting that Gannon's body had been transported in this vehicle after his death. Surveillance footage from around the neighborhood was proving invaluable. While Letitia claimed Gannon had left on foot to visit a friend, security cameras told a different story. The footage showed Letitia's SUV leaving the neighborhood on January 27th, but when it returned, only Letitia was visible in the vehicle. Where was Gannon? On March 2nd, 2020, more than a month after Gannon's disappearance, authorities had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest. Letitia Stotch was taken into custody, initially on charges of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and child abuse resulting in death. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. This wasn't a stranger abduction or a random act of violence. This was a stepmother, someone entrusted with a child's care, allegedly responsible for that child's death. But Letitia's legal troubles were just beginning. During her transport from South Carolina, where she had been arrested, back to Colorado Springs, she allegedly attacked a deputy and was held in a Kansas jail. Her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and it would only get worse as the case progressed. On March 11th, Letitia Stotch made her first appearance in Colorado's 4th Judicial District Court, formally charged with first-degree murder. But the most heartbreaking development was yet to come. 6 days later, on March 17th, 2 bridge inspectors in Florida made a discovery that would close one chapter of this tragic story while opening another. Under a bridge along Highway 90 in the Florida Panhandle, approximately 1,500 miles from Colorado Springs, they found what appeared to be human remains in a suitcase. The suitcase was large, blue, and had obviously been there for some time. Inside, authorities discovered the decomposed body of a child. Dental records would later confirm what everyone feared. These were the remains of Gannon Stotch. The discovery answered the question of where Gannon was, but it raised so many others. How had his body ended up in Florida? When had he been transported there? And perhaps most chillingly, had he been alive during that journey? Law enforcement announced the discovery on March 20th, and additional charges were filed against Letitia Stotch. The case was no longer about a missing child. It was now a murder investigation with a body, physical evidence, and a suspect in custody. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, a horrifying picture began to emerge. They believed that Letitia had killed Gannon in his bedroom on the afternoon of January 27th, then spent the rest of that day and the following days orchestrating an elaborate cover-up. The evidence suggested that after murdering her stepson, Letitia had placed his body in her SUV and initially disposed of it somewhere near Highway 105 and South Perry Park Road in Larkspur, Colorado. But that wasn't the end of Gannon's journey. Investigators believe that Letitia returned to retrieve the body, possibly concerned that it might be discovered in Colorado. She then transported Gannon's remains across the country, a journey that would take her through multiple states before ultimately leaving his body under that bridge in Florida. The logistics of this cross-country journey while carrying the body of a murdered child spoke to a level of premeditation and callousness that was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a crime of passion followed by panic. This was calculated, methodical, and cruel. The case against Letitia Stotch wasn't built solely on physical evidence and forensic analysis. Some of the most powerful testimony would come from those who knew her best, her own family members. Dakota Lowry, Letitia's half-brother, would later provide crucial testimony during the trial. He had helped Letitia move out of the Stotch family home in Lorson Ranch just days after Gannon's disappearance. During that move, one particular suitcase caught his attention. The suitcase was large and appeared extremely heavy, too heavy for Letitia to lift on her own. When he offered to help her carry it, she adamantly refused, insisting she could manage it herself. At the time, he thought it was strange but didn't dwell on it. Later, when he learned about the discovery of Gannon's body in a suitcase in Florida, the memory took on a horrifying new meaning. During his testimony, Lowry would tell the court, "At that point, I knew she did it." The realization that he had potentially witnessed his sister loading a suitcase containing his stepnephew's body was devastating. This wasn't just evidence in a murder case. This was a family torn apart by unimaginable betrayal. The trial of Letitia Stotch began in April 2023, more than 3 years after Gannon's murder. The courtroom was packed with media, family members, and members of the public who had followed the case since its beginning. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the chance to finally hear all the evidence and see justice served. Letitia had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that mental illness had driven her to commit this horrific act. Her defense team brought in psychiatrists who testified about her mental state, attempting to convince the jury that she was not responsible for her actions due to psychological disorders. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They presented evidence of premeditation, showing that Letitia's actions after the murder demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an understanding of right and wrong. The elaborate cover-up, the lies to investigators, the disposal and transportation of the body. All of this suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was trying to avoid consequences. The trial lasted 5 weeks, and the prosecution's case included testimony from a wide range of witnesses. Gannon's father, Al Stotch, took the stand, where he was asked to identify his son from a photograph. Fighting back tears, he said simply, "That's my boy." The moment encapsulated the human cost of this crime, a father's love for his murdered child. Letitia's former employers testified about her behavior in the days following Gannon's disappearance. Family members shared their observations and suspicions. Investigators detailed their findings, walking the jury through the evidence step by step. Forensic experts explained the blood evidence, the DNA analysis, and what the physical evidence revealed about the crime. State psychiatrists testified about their evaluations of Letitia, challenging the defense's claims about her mental state. They argued that while she may have had psychological issues, she was still capable of understanding the nature and consequences of her actions. The defense's strategy centered around the insanity plea, arguing that Letitia was suffering from severe mental illness that prevented her from understanding that her actions were wrong. They brought in Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a controversial psychiatrist known for her work with violent criminals and her advocacy for the insanity defense. Dr. Lewis testified about her evaluation of Letitia, claiming that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder and other severe mental health conditions. According to the defense, these disorders had created an alternative personality or state of mind that was responsible for Gannon's death, not the real Letitia. The defense presented evidence of Letitia's troubled childhood, previous mental health issues, and erratic behavior leading up to the murder. They argued that this was not a case of an evil stepmother choosing to kill her stepson, but rather a mentally ill woman whose disorders had driven her to commit an act she wouldn't normally be capable of. However, the prosecution successfully challenged this narrative. They presented evidence showing that Letitia's behavior after the murder, the elaborate lies, the cover-up, the disposal of evidence, all demonstrated that she understood the wrongness of her actions and was trying to avoid punishment. They argued that someone truly in the grip of a dissociative episode wouldn't be capable of such calculated deception. After hearing weeks of testimony and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, the jury began their deliberations. The community held its breath, waiting to see if justice would be served for 11-year-old Gannon Stotch. The jury rejected Letitia's insanity defense, finding her guilty on all charges. The verdict was read in a packed courtroom, and the relief was palpable. Gannon's family finally had the justice they had been seeking for more than 3 years. The charges included first-degree murder of a child under 12 by someone in a position of trust, tampering with a deceased body, and tampering with evidence. Each charge carried serious penalties, but for a crime this heinous, only the most severe punishment would be appropriate. On May 8, 2023, Letitia Stotch appeared before the judge for sentencing. The courtroom was once again packed as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, and the judge prepared to hand down the sentence. The judge sentenced Letitia to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder charge. She received a second, concurrent life sentence for the first-degree murder of a child under the age of 12. Additionally, she was sentenced to 12 years for tampering with a body and 18 months for tampering with evidence, with these latter sentences to be served consecutively. The judge called this case one of the most horrific he had ever seen, emphasizing the particular cruelty involved in murdering a child who should have been safe in his own home with someone he trusted. The sentence ensured that Letitia Stotch would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. The murder of Gannon Stotch sent shockwaves through the Colorado Springs community and beyond. This was every parent's worst nightmare. A child killed by someone who was supposed to protect him. The case highlighted the vulnerability of children in blended families and the importance of thorough background checks and ongoing vigilance in protecting our most vulnerable members of society. The case also demonstrated the incredible dedication of law enforcement officers and investigators who refused to give up on finding the truth. Their meticulous work, from the initial response to the final presentation of evidence in court, ensured that Gannon received the justice he deserved. For Gannon's father, Al Stotch, the conclusion of the trial brought some measure of closure, but the pain of losing his son will never fully heal. In his victim impact statement, he spoke about the bright, energetic boy who had been taken from him, and the future that Gannon would never have the chance to experience. While justice has been served in the legal sense, many questions about this case may never be fully answered. What drove Letitia to commit such a heinous act against her stepson? Was this a premeditated murder? Or did it begin as abuse that escalated tragically? How long had Gannon been suffering before that final, fatal day? The case also raises broader questions about the warning signs of child abuse and the systems in place to protect children. Were there red flags that were missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? These questions serve as a reminder that the murder of Gannon Stotch wasn't just an isolated criminal act. It was a failure of the systems and relationships that should have kept him safe. While we can't bring Gannon back, we can learn from this case and work to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As we conclude the story, it's important to remember that behind all the legal proceedings, evidence, and media coverage was a real child with hopes, dreams, and a future that was stolen from him. Gannon Stotch was more than just a victim in a true crime case. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and a little boy who deserved to grow up, go to school, play with friends, and experience all the joys that childhood should bring. His memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved him and in the efforts of those who continue to work to protect children from harm. While his life was cut tragically short, the pursuit of justice in his case demonstrated that society will not tolerate the abuse and murder of children, and that those who commit such acts will be held accountable for their crimes. The case of Gannon Stotch reminds us of the preciousness of childhood innocence and the responsibility we all share to protect the children in our communities. It's a somber reminder that evil can sometimes hide behind a familiar face, but it's also a testament to the power of justice and the determination of those who refuse to let such crimes go unpunished. In the quiet of this late night, as we reflect on this tragic case, Let us remember 11-year-old Gannon Stauch not as a victim, but as a child who was loved, whose life had value, and whose memory continues to inspire efforts to protect other children from similar fates. Though his voice was silenced too soon, his story continues to be told, ensuring that he will never be forgotten. Rest in peace, Gannon. Your short life mattered, and your memory will endure long after those who wronged you have been forgotten by history. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet suburban town of Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, England, March 21st, 2002 began like any ordinary Thursday. The spring air carried the promise of warmer days ahead, and 13-year-old Amanda Jane Dowler, known to everyone as Millie, was looking forward to the end of another school day at Heathside School in nearby Weybridge. Millie was a bright, vivacious teenager with shoulder-length blonde hair and an infectious smile that could light up any room. She was the kind of girl who made friends easily, loved music, and had dreams that stretched far beyond the borders of her small English town. Her family, parents Bob and Sally, and older sister Gemma, were close-knit, the kind of family that gathered around the dinner table each evening to share stories of their day. That Thursday afternoon at 3:07 p.m., Millie left Heathside School just as she had done countless times before. She walked with a friend to Weybridge railway station, their conversation probably filled with the typical concerns of 13-year-old girls: homework, weekend plans, maybe discussions about music or television shows. The two girls boarded the train together, chatting as the countryside rolled past their window. But this day would be different from all the others. Instead of traveling to her usual stop at Hersham, Millie decided to get off one stop earlier at Walton-on-Thames station. It was a spontaneous decision. She wanted to grab something to eat at a local cafe with friends. These are the small, seemingly insignificant choices that can change everything, the butterfly effect in its most tragic form. At the cafe, Millie spent time with her friends, laughing and talking as teenagers do. The atmosphere was light, carefree. None of them could have imagined that these would be among the last normal moments of Millie's life. After some time at the cafe, Millie prepared to make the journey home. It was a route she knew well, a path she had walked many times before. At 3:47 p.m., Millie called her father Bob from her mobile phone. Her voice was cheerful, normal, reassuring. "I'll be home in about half an hour, Dad," she told him. It was the kind of call that parents receive dozens of times without a second thought. A simple check-in, a routine update. Bob Dowler had no reason to worry. His daughter was responsible. She knew the area well, and it was still daylight. But Millie never made it home. Somewhere between that phone call and her intended arrival time, 13-year-old Millie Dowler vanished without a trace. She was last seen by a friend of her sister Gemma at around 4 p.m., walking along Station Avenue in Walton-on-Thames. She was carrying her school rucksack, her purse, and her mobile phone. She appeared completely normal, just another schoolgirl making her way home on a Thursday afternoon. When Millie failed to arrive home by her expected time, her parents weren't immediately alarmed. Teenagers can be unpredictable, and there could have been any number of innocent explanations for her delay. Perhaps she had stopped to talk to friends, or maybe she had decided to do some shopping. But as the minutes turned to hours, concern began to creep in. Bob and Sally Dowler waited, their worry growing with each passing minute. They called Millie's mobile phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. They contacted her friends, hoping someone might know where she was. By 7 p.m., with darkness falling and still no sign of their daughter, Bob and Sally made the decision that no parent ever wants to make. They called the police to report Millie as missing. The initial response was measured, professional, but tinged with the hope that this would be a brief scare with a happy ending. Missing teenager cases often resolve quickly. Kids sometimes lose track of time, phones die, plans change. The police began the standard procedures, taking detailed descriptions, gathering information about Millie's last known movements, and alerting patrol units to keep an eye out for a 13-year-old girl with blonde hair wearing her school uniform. But as the night stretched on and turned into the next day, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary missing person case. Millie was responsible, close to her family, and had no history of running away. The police response escalated accordingly. On March 24th, just 3 days after Millie's disappearance, Bob and Sally Dowler made their first public appeal for help. Standing before television cameras, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion, they pleaded with the public for any information about their daughter's whereabouts. Sally's voice trembled as she spoke about her beautiful, fun-loving daughter, while Bob struggled to maintain his composure as he begged anyone who might have seen Millie to come forward. The appeal captured the nation's attention. Millie's case had all the elements that make a story resonate with the public. A young, innocent victim, a close-knit family thrown into every parent's worst nightmare, and the terrifying randomness of a child vanishing in broad daylight from a safe, familiar area. The investigation that followed was massive in scope. Surrey police launched one of the largest missing person searches in British history. Hundreds of officers were deployed. Specialist search teams combed through parks and woodland. Helicopters circled overhead, and divers searched local waterways. The public response was overwhelming. Thousands of people called in with potential sightings, tips, and offers to help with the search. Every lead was followed up, no matter how remote or unlikely. Police officers knocked on doors throughout Walton-on-Thames and the surrounding areas, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual on March 21st. Security cameras were seized and analyzed frame by frame. The railway station where Millie had last been seen was treated as a potential crime scene, with forensic experts examining every surface for clues. As the days turned into weeks, the search expanded beyond Surrey. Police forces across the country were alerted, and Millie's photograph appeared on missing person posters in towns and cities from Scotland to Cornwall. The case received extensive media coverage, with newspapers printing daily updates and television news programs featuring regular segments about the search. But despite the massive effort, the extensive publicity, and the thousands of man-hours devoted to finding her, Millie seemed to have vanished completely. It was as if she had simply evaporated on that quiet Thursday afternoon, leaving no trace behind except the memories of those who loved her. The Dowler family was trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. Bob and Sally continued to make regular appeals to the media, their hope and desperation evident in every word they spoke. They established a routine of sorts, checking in regularly with the police, following up on potential leads, and clinging to the belief that somehow, somewhere, their daughter was still alive and would come home to them. Gemma Dowler, Millie's older sister, struggled with the sudden absence of her sibling. The two sisters had been close, sharing the typical bond of siblings who were only a few years apart in age. The house felt empty without Millie's laughter, her music, and her constant chatter about school and friends. As spring turned to summer, the intensive search efforts began to wind down. The initial surge of public interest started to fade as other news stories captured the headlines. But for the Dowler family, there was no moving on, no return to normal life. Every day brought the same questions. Where was Millie? What had happened to her? Was she still alive? The police investigation continued, but with fewer resources and less public attention. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on countless leads, and explored every possible theory about Millie's disappearance. They looked into the possibility that she had been taken by someone she knew, that she had been the victim of a random abduction, or that she might have run away voluntarily. But months of investigation had produced no answers, no breakthrough, no trace of what had happened to her. Then, on September 18, 2002, nearly 6 months after Millie had vanished, the worst fears of everyone who had hoped for her safe return were confirmed. Two mushroom pickers walking through Yateley Heath Woods near Yateley in Hampshire, about 25 miles from where Millie had disappeared, made a grim discovery. Hidden among the trees and undergrowth, they found human remains. The identification process was careful and thorough, but the conclusion was devastating. The remains were those of Millie Dowler. The 13-year-old schoolgirl who had vanished on her way home from school was finally found, but it was too late. She had been dead for months, possibly since shortly after her disappearance. The discovery of Millie's body transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a murder inquiry. The scene in Yateley Heath Woods was secured and examined by forensic specialists, but the passage of time and exposure to the elements had severely limited the physical evidence available. Crucially, none of Millie's personal belongings, her school rucksack, her purse, or her mobile phone, were found with her remains. These items had disappeared along with their owner, leaving investigators with few clues about what had happened. The news of the discovery hit the Dowler family like a physical blow. After months of hoping, praying, and refusing to give up the belief that Millie might still be alive, they now had to face the terrible reality that their daughter was gone forever. The grief was overwhelming, but mixed with it was a fierce determination to find whoever was responsible for taking Millie's life. Detective Chief Inspector Maria Woodall, who was leading the murder investigation, held a press conference to update the media and the public. She confirmed that the remains found in Hampshire were those of Millie Dowler and announced that Surrey police were treating the case as a murder investigation. The search for Millie was over, but the search for her killer was just beginning. The murder investigation was complex and challenging. The location where Millie's body was found was remote and had not been thoroughly searched during the initial missing person inquiry. The killer had clearly chosen the spot carefully, hoping that the remains would never be discovered, or that by the time they were found, any useful evidence would be long gone. Forensic examination of the scene and the remains provided some clues, but they were limited. The cause of death could not be definitively determined due to the condition of the remains. What was clear was that Millie had been murdered, and her body had been deliberately concealed in the woodland. The killer was someone who knew the area well enough to find such a remote hiding place. The investigation team began the painstaking process of re-examining everything they had learned during the missing person inquiry. They reviewed thousands of statements, reanalyzed CCTV footage, and looked for any connections between Millie's disappearance and other crimes in the area. They appealed once again to the public for information, hoping that someone might remember something that could provide a breakthrough in the case. Years passed with little progress. The case remained open, and detectives continued to follow up on new leads as they emerged, but the trail had gone cold. The Dowler family lived with the knowledge that somewhere, Millie's killer was walking free, possibly planning to strike again. It was a burden that no family should have to bear. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. In February 2008, nearly 6 years after Millie's murder, police arrested a man named Levi Belfield in connection with the murders of two other young women, Marcia McDonnell and Amelie Delagrange. Belfield was a 39-year-old former nightclub bouncer with a history of violence and a pattern of targeting young women. Belfield was found guilty of murdering two young women, Marcia McDonnell and Amelie Delagrange. They had been bludgeoned to death while out in public. Belfield was also found guilty of attempting to murder another woman, Kate Sheedy. The successful prosecution of these cases gave investigators new hope that they might finally be able to solve Millie's murder as well. Levi Belfield was a disturbing figure, a man whose entire adult life seemed to have been dedicated to violence against women. He had 5 children with 3 different women and had been charged in the past with theft, assault, and attempted murder. Known for his volatile temper, Belfield had a reputation for treating women like possessions, frequently subjecting his partners to physical abuse. The investigation into Belfield's possible involvement in Millie's murder required investigators to re-examine the case from the beginning. They looked at his whereabouts on March 21, 2002, studied his movement patterns, and searched for any connections between him and the area where Millie had vanished. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Belfield had lived in the area around the time of Millie's disappearance. He was familiar with Walton-on-Thames, knew the railway station, and often drove through the streets where Millie had last been seen. He had access to vehicles and had demonstrated in his other crimes that he was willing to abduct women in broad daylight from public places. The evidence against Belfield was largely circumstantial, but it was compelling. Cell phone records showed that his mobile phone had been in the vicinity of where Millie disappeared on the day she vanished. Witnesses placed him in the area around the time of her disappearance. His pattern of behavior in his other crimes closely matched what investigators believed had happened to Millie. On March 30, 2010, 8 years after Millie's disappearance, police arrested Levi Belfield and charged him with her kidnap and murder. The arrest brought a mixture of relief and apprehension to the Dowler family. After years of waiting, they finally had a suspect in custody, but they also knew that securing a conviction would be far from certain. Belfield's trial began on May 10, 2011 at the Central Criminal Court before Mr. Justice Wilkie and concluded on June 23, 2011. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment the following day. The trial was emotionally grueling for the Dowler family, who had to relive the worst period of their lives while listening to the prosecution's case against the man accused of murdering their daughter. The prosecution painted a picture of Belfield as a predator who had specifically targeted young women in West London and Surrey. They argued that on March 21, 2002, he had been prowling the streets in his vehicle when he spotted Millie walking home from the station. Seeing an opportunity, he had approached her, possibly offering her a lift or using some other ruse to get her into his vehicle. The defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof that Belfield had killed Millie. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime and suggested that the prosecution case was based on speculation and coincidence rather than hard facts. But the jury was convinced by the prosecution's argument. On June 23, 2011, Belfield was further found guilty of the murder of Millie Dowler, and the judge imposed a whole life order, meaning that he would never be released from prison. The conviction brought a sense of justice to the Dowler family, but it could never bring Millie back or erase the years of pain and uncertainty they had endured. Bob and Sally Dowler spoke of their relief that Millie's killer had finally been brought to justice, but they also made it clear that their lives had been permanently changed by their loss. The case had broader implications as well. It highlighted the dangers that young people face, even in seemingly safe environments. It demonstrated the importance of persistent police work and the value of never giving up on a case, even when the trail appears to have gone completely cold. In a shocking development in January 2016, Belfield admits abducting, raping, and murdering Millie Dowler in a detailed confession to police. The confession provided the Dowler family with answers they had been seeking for over a decade, but it also revealed the horrific details of their daughter's final hours. Now we know the final hours of Millie's life. Perhaps her soul, at long last, can finally rest in peace, her family said in a harrowing statement. The confession was both a blessing and a curse. It provided closure, but it also confirmed their worst fears about what Millie had suffered. The Millie Dowler case remains one of the most significant criminal cases in recent British history. It exposed the failures of the initial investigation, highlighted the persistence required to solve complex crimes, and demonstrated the devastating impact that violent crime has on families and communities. For the Dowler family, the conviction of Levi Belfield marked the end of one chapter in their story, but it was not the end of their journey. They have continued to honor Millie's memory through various charitable activities and have worked to support other families who have experienced similar tragedies. The case also had unexpected consequences that extended far beyond the criminal justice system. During the investigation, it was revealed that journalists from the News of the World newspaper had illegally hacked into Millie's voicemail messages while she was still missing. This revelation became a central part of the phone hacking scandal that ultimately led to the closure of the newspaper and significant changes in media regulation in the United Kingdom. Today, more than 20 years after Millie Dowler vanished on her walk home from school, her case continues to serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment with our loved ones. It's a story of loss, of justice delayed but ultimately achieved, and of a family's incredible strength in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Millie would have been in her 30s now, perhaps married with children of her own. She might have pursued her love of music, traveled the world, or found her calling in any number of fields. Instead, her story ends in a woodland in Hampshire, a 13-year-old girl whose life was cut short by a man who saw her not as a human being with dreams and potential, but as a victim to satisfy his violent urges. The investigation into Millie's murder took 9 years to reach its conclusion. 9 years of painstaking police work, of following leads that went nowhere, of scientific advances that provided new ways to examine old evidence. It was a testament to the dedication of the investigators who never gave up on finding justice for Millie, even when the case seemed hopeless. Levi Belfield remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. Belfield was the first prisoner to have received 2 whole life orders, reflecting the severity of his crimes and the danger he posed to society. His name has become synonymous with some of the most brutal crimes committed in Britain in the early 2000s. The case also changed how missing person investigations are conducted in the United Kingdom. The initial response to Millie's disappearance was criticized for being too slow and too limited in scope. Lessons learned from the case led to improvements in police procedures and better coordination between different forces when dealing with missing person cases. For those who knew Millie personally, her family, friends, teachers, and classmates, she is remembered not as a victim, but as a vibrant young woman who brought joy to everyone around her. They remember her smile, her laughter, her dreams for the future. They remember the girl she was, not the tragedy that befell her. The Millie Dowler case is ultimately a story about the triumph of justice over evil, about the power of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and about the strength of the human spirit when confronted with the worst that life can offer. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there are people working tirelessly to bring light back into the world. As we reflect on Millie's story, we're reminded of the importance of community, of looking out for one another, and of never taking for granted the simple moments that make up our daily lives. A 13-year-old girl's walk home from school should have been unremarkable, forgotten within hours. Instead, it became a journey that captivated a nation and ultimately helped bring a dangerous predator to justice. Millie Dowler's legacy extends far beyond the circumstances of her death. It lives on in the improvements to policing procedures that her case inspired, in the awareness it raised about the dangers that young people face, and in the strength and dignity shown by her family in their quest for justice. In the quiet corners of Surrey, where Millie spent her short life, people still remember the bright, enthusiastic teenager who vanished one March afternoon. They remember not the headlines or the court proceedings, but the girl who loved music, who made friends easily, who had dreams that will never be fulfilled. This is the story of Millie Dowler, a story of loss, but also a story of love, determination, and the unshakable belief that justice, however delayed, will ultimately prevail. It's a story that reminds us of the precious nature of life and the importance of cherishing every day we have with those we love. Rest in peace, Millie Dowler. Your story will not be forgotten. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to Dallas, Texas, where a story of jealousy, obsession, and murder unfolded in the late summer of 2015. This is the story of Dr. Kendra Hatcher, a beloved pediatric dentist whose life was cut short by a web of deception that would eventually lead investigators across state lines and international borders. So as we settle in, let me tell you about a case that shocked the Dallas community and revealed the dangerous depths of obsession. Dr. Kendra Hatcher was 35 years old in September of 2015, living what many would consider an ideal life in the vibrant uptown district of Dallas. She had worked hard to build her career as a pediatric dentist, dedicating herself to caring for children and making their dental visits as comfortable as possible. Her colleagues and friends knew her as someone who genuinely cared about others, always ready with a warm smile and kind word. Kendra lived in the Gables Park 17 apartments, a modern high-rise complex that offered the urban lifestyle she enjoyed. The building featured secure parking, modern amenities, and the kind of safety features that made residents feel secure in their daily routines. For Kendra, it was home, a place where she could unwind after long days at her dental practice and plan for a future that seemed full of promise. In early 2015, Kendra had begun dating Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, known to friends and family as Ricky. He was a fellow healthcare professional, and their relationship had blossomed into something serious over the months they'd been together. Just a week before September 2015, Kendra had taken a significant step in their relationship by flying to San Francisco to meet Ricky's parents. The meeting had gone wonderfully, and both families were pleased with the connection between the young couple. Ricky was charming, successful, and seemed to genuinely care for Kendra. What she didn't know, however, was that his past relationship had left behind someone who was not ready to let go. Someone who had been watching, planning, and seething with jealousy as Kendra and Ricky grew closer together. Brenda Delgado had been a significant part of Ricky Paniagua's life from 2012 until early 2015. Their relationship had been intense, passionate, and tumultuous, characterized by the kind of on-again, off-again dynamic that can be both intoxicating and destructive. Brenda, a woman in her mid-30s, had become deeply invested in the relationship with Ricky, perhaps more invested than he had been. When their relationship finally ended in early 2015, Brenda struggled to accept that it was truly over. While Ricky had moved on and was beginning to build something new with Kendra, Brenda remained fixated on what she had lost. The end of their relationship had not meant the end of her surveillance of Ricky's life. Unbeknownst to both Ricky and Kendra, Brenda had been conducting what could only be described as an intensive spying operation. She monitored Ricky's social media accounts, tracked his movements, and gradually became aware of his new relationship with the pediatric dentist. What she discovered only fueled her obsession and resentment. As summer turned to fall in 2015, Brenda learned that Ricky and Kendra's relationship was becoming more serious. The trip to San Francisco to meet his parents was particularly difficult for Brenda to accept, as it represented a level of commitment that she felt should have been hers. The knowledge that Ricky was introducing another woman to his family, that he was building a future with someone else, became too much for her to bear. But Brenda's response to this pain would be far from typical. Instead of seeking help, moving on, or finding healthy ways to process her feelings, she began to formulate a plan that would eliminate what she saw as the obstacle to her happiness. Kendra Hatcher herself. By late August 2015, Brenda Delgado had moved beyond passive surveillance to active planning. She began reaching out to acquaintances, looking for people who might be willing to help her with what she initially presented as a robbery. Brenda was careful about how she presented her request, framing it as a way to scare Kendra or to steal her belongings, rather than revealing the true violent nature of what she had in mind. One of the people Brenda approached was Crystal Cortez, a young woman of just 22 or 23 years old. Crystal was struggling financially and was attracted to the promise of easy money. Brenda told Crystal that she wanted someone to rob Kendra, to take her purse and jewelry, making it appear to be a random crime. What Crystal may not have fully understood initially was that Brenda's true intention went far beyond theft. Brenda also connected with Christopher Love, a man with a criminal background who was willing to participate in illegal activities for payment. Love would later be identified as the person who would actually carry out the shooting. The three conspirators began to coordinate their plans, with Brenda providing information about Kendra's routines, her apartment complex, and her schedule. The planning was meticulous. Brenda used her surveillance of Ricky's activities to determine when Kendra would be most vulnerable. She learned about their upcoming vacation to Cancun, scheduled for early September, and realized that the evening before their departure would be an ideal time to strike. Kendra would be at home, likely packing or preparing for the trip, and Ricky would not be with her. As September 2nd approached, all the pieces of Brenda's plan were falling into place. She had her accomplices, she had the timing, and she had convinced herself that removing Kendra from the equation would somehow bring Ricky back to her. It was a delusion that would soon lead to tragedy. Wednesday, September 2nd, 2015, began as what should have been an exciting day for Kendra Hatcher. She and Ricky were scheduled to fly to Cancun the following morning for a romantic long weekend getaway. It was the kind of trip that couples take when they're falling deeper in love, the kind of experience that creates lasting memories and strengthens bonds. Kendra spent the day at her dental practice, seeing her young patients and wrapping up work before her vacation. Her colleagues later remembered her being in good spirits, excited about the trip and looking forward to spending time with Ricky in Mexico. She had planned to go home that evening to pack and prepare for their early morning flight. As evening approached, Kendra finished her work and made the familiar drive to her apartment at Gables Park 17. The uptown Dallas complex was bustling with residents returning home from work, the kind of urban energy that Kendra enjoyed as part of her lifestyle choice to live in the heart of the city. Around 7:30 p.m., Kendra's BMW pulled into the parking garage beneath her apartment building. It was a routine she had performed countless times before, driving into the secure garage, parking in her designated spot, and taking the elevator up to her apartment. The garage was well lit and monitored by security cameras, features that were supposed to provide safety and peace of mind for residents. But on this evening, Kendra was not alone in the garage. A dark Jeep Cherokee had followed her into the parking structure, carrying two people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Crystal Cortez was behind the wheel, while Christopher Love sat in the passenger seat, ready to execute the violent plan that Brenda Delgado had set in motion. What happened next would be over in moments, but its impact would reverberate through multiple lives and families for years to come. As Kendra parked her car and gathered her belongings, she had no idea that she was walking into a trap that had been carefully planned and patiently awaited. The security cameras in the Gables Park 17 parking garage would later provide investigators with crucial evidence, but they also captured the final moments of Kendra Hatcher's life in stark, silent footage that would haunt everyone who viewed it. As Kendra stepped out of her BMW, Christopher Love approached her with what appeared to be the intention of robbing her. The encounter began as Brenda had planned. It looked like a robbery, with Love demanding Kendra's purse and belongings. For a moment, it might have seemed like exactly the kind of random urban crime that unfortunately occurs in cities across America. But this was never intended to be just a robbery. As Kendra complied with Love's demands, handing over her purse, the situation escalated rapidly. Love pulled out a gun and shot Kendra at close range. The sound echoed through the concrete parking structure as Kendra fell to the ground, mortally wounded. The entire incident lasted only minutes. Crystal Cortez, who had been waiting in the Jeep Cherokee as the getaway driver, watched in horror as the plan unfolded exactly as Brenda Delgado had intended. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was murder, carefully planned and coldly executed. Love quickly returned to the Jeep, and Crystal drove them out of the parking garage. They disappeared into the Dallas night, leaving Kendra dying on the concrete floor of what should have been the safety of her own apartment building. The security cameras captured their vehicle leaving the scene, but in those immediate moments, they must have believed they had committed the perfect crime. Kendra Hatcher, just 35 years old, with a promising career and a bright future ahead of her, died alone in that parking garage. She would never see Cancun with Ricky, never meet his family again, never continue building the life they had been planning together. In a matter of minutes, Brenda Delgado's jealousy and rage had destroyed multiple lives forever. Ricky Paniagua had been waiting for Kendra to return home that evening, likely excited about their upcoming trip and perhaps helping her pack or simply enjoying a quiet evening together before their early morning flight. When she didn't arrive as expected, he initially might have assumed she was running late from work or had stopped somewhere on the way home. But as the minutes turned to hours, concern began to grow. Ricky tried calling Kendra's phone, but got no response. This was unusual for her. She was typically good about communicating, especially when they had specific plans. The worry that something might be wrong began to creep into his mind. Eventually, Ricky's concern drove him to go looking for Kendra. He made his way to her apartment building, perhaps thinking she might be inside and simply not answering her phone. But when he arrived at Gables Park 17, he made a discovery that would change his life forever. In the parking garage, Ricky found Kendra's body. The woman he had been planning to spend a romantic weekend with, the woman he had introduced to his parents just a week earlier, was lying on the concrete floor, the victim of a violent attack. The trauma of finding someone you love in such circumstances is impossible to fully comprehend. The shock, the disbelief, the desperate hope that somehow it's not as bad as it appears. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics and police officers flooded the scene, but it was too late to save Kendra. She was pronounced dead at the scene, the victim of what initially appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. Her purse was missing, her jewelry taken, and there were no obvious clues about who might have committed such a crime. For Ricky, the world had suddenly and violently shifted. Instead of waking up the next morning to catch a flight to Mexico with the woman he loved, he was beginning the process of identifying her body and trying to understand how something so horrible could have happened to someone so innocent. The Dallas Police Department responded to what appeared to be a straightforward, if tragic, case of urban violence. A successful professional woman had been killed in an apparent robbery, and while such crimes were always devastating for the families involved, they followed predictable patterns that investigators knew how to pursue. Detective Eric Barnes was assigned to lead the investigation into Kendra Hatcher's murder. Barnes was an experienced investigator who had seen many cases over his career, but what he would uncover in this case would prove to be unlike anything he had encountered before. Years later, he would testify that the plot to kill Kendra Hatcher was unlike any case he had ever investigated. The initial investigation focused on the security camera footage from the Gables Park 17 parking garage. The cameras had captured the attack, showing a dark Jeep Cherokee following Kendra into the garage and then leaving shortly after the shooting. While the footage was not crystal clear, it provided investigators with their first solid lead. They needed to identify the occupants of that Jeep. The investigation team began the painstaking work of tracking down the vehicle. They analyzed the footage frame by frame, looking for any identifying characteristics that might help them locate the Jeep Cherokee. They also began interviewing residents of the apartment complex, Kendra's colleagues at work, and anyone else who might have information about her final days. What emerged from these initial interviews was a picture of a woman who lived a relatively quiet, professional life. Kendra didn't seem to have enemies, wasn't involved in any obvious conflicts, and hadn't reported feeling threatened or unsafe. This made the apparent random robbery even more puzzling. Why would someone target her specifically? As the investigation continued, detectives began to look more closely at Kendra's personal relationships. They spoke with Ricky Paniagua, who was cooperative but devastated by the loss. During these conversations, Ricky mentioned his former relationship with Brenda Delgado, but initially, there was no reason to suspect that this past relationship had any connection to Kendra's murder. Within days of Kendra's murder, the investigation took a significant turn when police were able to identify the Jeep Cherokee seen in the security footage. Through careful analysis of the vehicle's characteristics and license plate information, they traced the Jeep to Crystal Cortez, the young woman who had been recruited by Brenda Delgado to serve as the getaway driver. On September 7, 2015, just 5 days after Kendra's murder, Crystal Cortez was arrested and charged with capital murder. She was initially held on $250,000 bail, later increased to $500,000 as the seriousness of the charges became clear. For investigators, this arrest represented a major breakthrough, but it also raised more questions than it answered. When questioned by detectives, Crystal initially tried to minimize her involvement, but eventually, she began to provide information about the crime. What she revealed shocked the investigators and completely changed their understanding of what had happened to Kendra Hatcher. This had not been a random robbery at all, it had been a carefully planned murder-for-hire scheme. Crystal told detectives that she had been approached by Brenda Delgado with a proposition. Brenda had initially described it as a robbery, offering to pay Crystal to drive someone to steal from a woman who, according to Brenda, had wronged her. Crystal, who was struggling financially, had agreed to participate for the promised payment. But as Crystal provided more details, it became clear that she had either been deceived about the true nature of the plan or had chosen to ignore the obvious signs that this was intended to be more than just a theft. She identified Christopher Love as the man who had actually shot Kendra, and she revealed that Brenda Delgado had been the mastermind behind the entire operation. When detectives asked Crystal why Brenda would want to arrange a robbery of Kendra Hatcher, Crystal provided the key insight that would unlock the entire case. She told them that she believed they were going back and forth between the same guy. This simple statement revealed the motive that had driven Brenda to murder: jealousy over her ex-boyfriend's new relationship. With Crystal Cortez in custody and providing information, detectives quickly moved to apprehend Christopher Love, the man she had identified as the actual shooter. Love, who had a criminal background that made him willing to participate in illegal activities for money, was arrested and also charged with capital murder. Meanwhile, investigators began to piece together the complex relationship dynamics that had led to Kendra's death. They learned that Brenda Delgado had dated Ricky Paniagua on and off from 2012 until the beginning of 2015, and that she had struggled to accept the end of their relationship when Ricky began dating Kendra. What emerged was a picture of obsessive surveillance and planning that was chilling in its scope and duration. Brenda had been monitoring Ricky's activities for months, tracking his social media presence, and gradually learning about his relationship with Kendra. She had discovered details about their relationship milestones, including the recent trip to San Francisco to meet Ricky's parents and their planned vacation to Cancun. The timing of the murder was not coincidental. Brenda had specifically chosen to act on September 2nd because she knew that Ricky and Kendra were scheduled to leave for their romantic getaway the following morning. In her twisted logic, she may have believed that eliminating Kendra before this trip would somehow prevent the relationship from progressing further, or even bring Ricky back to her. Investigators also learned that Brenda had been careful to structure the crime to look like a random robbery. She had instructed her accomplices to take Kendra's purse and jewelry, and to make the attack appear to be the work of opportunistic criminals rather than a targeted assassination. If not for the security camera footage and Crystal Cortez's eventual cooperation, this deception might have succeeded. As the investigation progressed, detectives prepared to arrest Brenda Delgado. But when they went to bring her in for questioning on September 4th, 2015, they discovered that their primary suspect had vanished. Brenda had fled, apparently realizing that the investigation was closing in on her involvement in the murder. Brenda Delgado's disappearance added a new dimension to the case, transforming it from a local murder investigation into a multi-jurisdictional manhunt. Investigators quickly determined that Brenda had fled to Mexico, taking advantage of her ability to cross the border and disappear into a country where extradition proceedings could be lengthy and complicated. For the families affected by this crime, Kendra's loved ones and even Ricky Paniagua, who was grappling with the realization that his ex-girlfriend had murdered his current girlfriend, the knowledge that the mastermind behind this horrific act was free and potentially beyond the reach of American justice was devastating. The Dallas Police Department worked with federal authorities to locate Brenda in Mexico. The case attracted significant media attention, both because of its shocking nature and because of the international aspects of the investigation. A successful professional woman had been murdered by her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend in what amounted to a contract killing. It was the kind of story that captured public attention and outrage. Months passed with Brenda remaining at large. During this time, the cases against Crystal Cortez and Christopher Love moved forward through the legal system. Both faced capital murder charges, and prosecutors began building their cases against the two accomplices, while continuing to pursue the woman who had orchestrated the entire scheme. The frustration of having the primary suspect beyond immediate reach was compounded by the ongoing trauma experienced by everyone connected to Kendra. Her friends, family, and colleagues continued to mourn her loss, while knowing that the person most responsible for her death remained free. For Ricky, the situation was particularly complex. He had to process his grief over losing Kendra while also coming to terms with his own unwitting role in the circumstances that led to her death. Finally, in April 2016, after months of diplomatic negotiations and legal proceedings, Brenda Delgado was arrested in Mexico and eventually extradited back to the United States to face charges for her role in Kendra Hatcher's murder. Her capture closed one chapter in the case but opened another as the legal proceedings could finally move forward with all the major players in custody. The legal proceedings that followed Brenda Delgado's extradition would span several years and result in multiple trials as each participant in the murder plot faced the consequences of their actions. The complexity of the case, with its multiple defendants and intricate planning, meant that prosecutors had to carefully build their cases to ensure that justice would be served for Kendra Hatcher. Christopher Love, as the person who had actually pulled the trigger, faced the most severe consequences. His trial revealed the cold-blooded nature of the crime and the callous way in which he had ended Kendra's life. In October 2018, after hearing testimony about the planning and execution of the murder, a jury found Love guilty of capital murder. The following month, he was sentenced to death for his role in Kendra's killing. The sentencing phase of Love's trial was particularly emotional, as Kendra's friends and colleagues testified about the impact of her loss. Tammy Padano, a friend and dental school classmate of Kendra's, told the court about the lasting effects of the crime on those who knew and loved her. Her testimony revealed how the murder had affected not just Kendra's immediate family, but also the broader community of people whose lives she had touched. Crystal Cortez, the getaway driver, also faced serious consequences for her role in the crime. While her participation was somewhat less direct than Love's, her decision to drive the vehicle and facilitate the murder made her equally culpable in the eyes of the law. Her case proceeded through the system with the understanding that her cooperation with investigators might be considered in her sentencing, but that she would still face significant prison time for her involvement. Meanwhile, Brenda Delgado's case moved forward with prosecutors seeking capital murder charges against the woman they believed was the true architect of Kendra's death. However, because Delgado had been extradited from Mexico, she was not eligible for the death penalty due to agreements made during the extradition process. This meant that while she faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, she would not face execution even if convicted. Brenda Delgado's trial, which took place in 2019, was the culmination of years of investigation and legal proceedings. Prosecutors presented a comprehensive case that detailed her obsessive surveillance of Ricky Paniagua, her recruitment of accomplices, and her role in planning and orchestrating Kendra Hatcher's murder. The evidence against Brenda was substantial. Investigators had documented her communications with Crystal Cortez and Christopher Love, her surveillance activities, and her intimate knowledge of Kendra's schedule and routines. The prosecution argued that far from being a crime of passion or spontaneous act of violence, this had been a carefully planned and coldly executed murder designed to eliminate what Brenda saw as an obstacle to her relationship with Ricky. During the trial, the full scope of Brenda's obsession became clear. Testimony revealed that she had been monitoring Ricky's social media accounts and tracking his activities for months after their relationship ended. She had learned about his relationship with Kendra, about their trip to San Francisco to meet his parents, and about their planned vacation to Cancun. This information had been used to plan the timing and execution of the murder. The prosecution also presented evidence showing how Brenda had recruited her accomplices, presenting the crime initially as a robbery while knowing that it would result in Kendra's death. They argued that Brenda had been the mastermind of the operation, using others to carry out her deadly plan while attempting to maintain plausible deniability about her involvement. On June 6, 2019, after hearing all the evidence and testimony, a jury found Brenda Delgado guilty of capital murder in the death of Kendra Hatcher. The conviction represented a significant victory for prosecutors and provided some measure of closure for Kendra's loved ones, who had waited nearly 4 years for this moment of accountability. Although Brenda could not be sentenced to death due to the terms of her extradition, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This meant that she would spend the rest of her life incarcerated for her role in orchestrating Kendra's murder. The conviction of Brenda Delgado, along with the earlier convictions of Christopher Love and Crystal Cortez, brought the criminal proceedings in Kendra Hatcher's murder to a close. But for the people whose lives had been forever changed by this crime, the end of the trials did not mean the end of their struggles to process and understand what had happened. For Kendra's family, friends, and colleagues, her loss remained a daily reality that no legal verdict could fully address. The woman they had known as a caring pediatric dentist, a loyal friend, and a person with so much to offer the world, had been taken from them by someone's jealousy and obsession. The senseless nature of her death made it particularly difficult to accept and process. Ricky Paniagua faced his own complex emotional journey in the aftermath of Kendra's murder and the subsequent trials. He had to grapple with the knowledge that his past relationship had somehow led to the death of the woman he had come to love. While he bore no responsibility for Brenda's actions, the psychological impact of being connected to such a tragedy was undoubtedly profound. The case also had broader implications for how we understand domestic violence and stalking behavior. Brenda Delgado's obsessive surveillance of her ex-boyfriend and her willingness to murder his new girlfriend represented an extreme form of intimate partner violence that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of domestic abuse. Her actions highlighted the potential dangers that can arise when obsession and jealousy are allowed to fester without intervention. For the Dallas community, particularly the uptown area where Kendra had lived and worked, the case served as a reminder of how violence can intrude into even the safest-seeming environments. The fact that Kendra had been killed in the secure parking garage of her apartment building challenged assumptions about urban safety and security. The case also demonstrated the importance of thorough police investigation and the value of physical evidence like security camera footage. Without the surveillance video from the parking garage and the eventual cooperation of Crystal Cortez, it's possible that Brenda Delgado's role in the murder might never have been discovered, and the case might have remained an unsolved robbery homicide. As we near the end of this tragic story, it's worth reflecting on the various elements that came together to create such a devastating outcome. The murder of Kendra Hatcher was not the result of a single moment of poor judgment or a spontaneous act of violence. Instead, it was the culmination of months of obsessive behavior, careful planning, and a fundamental inability to accept that a relationship had ended. Brenda Delgado's actions reveal the dangerous potential of obsessive love and the lengths to which some people will go when they cannot accept rejection or loss. Her months-long surveillance of Ricky Paniagua and her gradual discovery of his relationship with Kendra represent a pattern of stalking behavior that escalated to its ultimate extreme. Rather than seeking help for her inability to move on, or finding healthy ways to process her feelings about the ended relationship, she chose a path that would destroy multiple lives. The case also highlights how easily ordinary people can become involved in extraordinary crimes. Crystal Cortez was a young woman struggling financially who made the catastrophic decision to participate in what she may have initially believed was just a robbery. Her choice to drive the getaway car made her complicit in a murder that would result in decades of imprisonment for her and death for an innocent person. Christopher Love's participation in the crime represents the tragic reality of how violence can be commoditized, how people with criminal backgrounds can be recruited to carry out the deadly fantasies of others. His willingness to kill a stranger for money demonstrates a level of moral bankruptcy that is difficult to comprehend. For Kendra herself, the tragedy lies not just in her death, but in all the life she didn't get to live. At 35, she was at a point where her personal and professional life seemed to be flourishing. Her relationship with Ricky was growing more serious, her dental practice was successful, and she had years of potential contributions to her community ahead of her. All of that was stolen by someone else's inability to let go of the past. The case serves as a reminder of the importance of recognizing warning signs of obsessive behavior and the potential value of intervention programs for people struggling to accept the end of relationships. While most people who experience heartbreak and rejection do not resort to violence, the small percentage who do can cause devastating harm to innocent people. The story of Kendra Hatcher's murder, while tragic, has contributed to important conversations about stalking, obsessive behavior, and the extreme forms that intimate partner violence can take. Law enforcement agencies have studied the case as an example of how traditional domestic violence can extend beyond the boundaries of a relationship to target new partners, and how surveillance technology can be used by obsessive individuals to track and target their victims. The case has also highlighted the international dimensions of modern crime, as Brenda Delgado's flight to Mexico demonstrated how criminals can attempt to use international borders to escape justice. The successful extradition and prosecution in this case may serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar strategies. while also demonstrating the importance of international cooperation in law enforcement. For the medical and dental communities, Kendra's death was a reminder of how violence can affect anyone, regardless of their professional status or the precautions they take for their safety. The fact that she was killed in what should have been the secure environment of her apartment building's parking garage underscored how determined criminals can find ways to reach their targets, even in seemingly safe locations. The lengthy investigation and prosecution of this case also demonstrated the importance of thorough police work and the value of physical evidence in solving complex crimes. Detective Eric Barnes and his colleagues spent years building the case against all three participants in the murder plot, ensuring that justice was ultimately served for Kendra and her loved ones. Perhaps most importantly, Kendra's story serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastating impact that violent crime has on families and communities. Her death rippled outward to affect not just her immediate family and friends, but also her colleagues, her patients, and the broader Dallas community that lost a dedicated healthcare professional. As we conclude this lengthy journey through the tragic story of Dr. Kendra Hatcher's murder, we're left with the sobering reality of how jealousy and obsession can lead to devastating consequences. What began as a failed relationship between Brenda Delgado and Ricky Paniagua escalated into a carefully planned murder that claimed the life of an innocent woman and destroyed multiple families. The case reminds us that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives have been forever altered by violence. Kendra Hatcher was not just a victim in a sensational case. She was a daughter, a friend, a healthcare provider who dedicated her life to caring for children. Her death represents not just the loss of one life, but the loss of all the good she might have done in the years she should have had. For those affected by similar experiences, whether dealing with obsessive ex-partners, working in law enforcement on such cases, or simply trying to understand how such tragedies occur, Kendra's story offers both warnings and lessons. It highlights the importance of taking stalking behavior seriously, the value of thorough investigation, and the need for support systems for both victims and those struggling with unhealthy relationship patterns. The convictions of Brenda Delgado, Christopher Love, and Crystal Cortez brought legal closure to the case, but the emotional impact of Kendra's murder continues to reverberate through the lives of those who knew and loved her. Her memory serves as a reminder of the importance of choosing compassion over obsession, acceptance over control, and healing over revenge. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we reflect on stories like this one, we're reminded of both the darkness that humans are capable of and the importance of the light that people like Kendra Hatcher bring to the world during their time with us. Her story, while tragic, serves as a testament to the value of every life and the devastating consequences when jealousy is allowed to fester into something deadly. May her memory be a blessing, and may her story serve as a warning about the paths we must never choose to walk, no matter how much pain we might be feeling. In remembering Kendra Hatcher, we honor not just her life, but the lives of all those who have been lost to senseless violence, and we commit ourselves to building a world where such tragedies become increasingly rare. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we're traveling back to 1991, to the sun-soaked beaches of Newport Beach, California, where a young woman's life would be cut tragically short in one of the most disturbing cases in Orange County history. This is the story of Denise Huber, a vibrant 23-year-old whose disappearance after a concert would launch one of the longest and most haunting investigations in California criminal history. So as we settle in, let me tell you about a case that would take 3 years to solve, involving a chance encounter on a dark freeway and a discovery so chilling it would earn the perpetrator the nickname, the Icebox Killer. In 1991, Newport Beach, California was the epitome of the American dream. Palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze, expensive cars cruised down pristine streets, and beautiful homes overlooked the Pacific Ocean. It was here, in this coastal paradise, that Dennis and Ione Huber had built their ideal life with their beloved daughter, Denise. Denise Huber was everything parents dream of in a child. At 23, she was intelligent, beautiful, and full of life. She had flowing blonde hair that caught the sunlight, bright eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and a smile that could light up any room she entered. Those who knew her described her as genuinely kind, the type of person who would go out of her way to help a stranger or comfort a friend in need. She lived with her parents in their comfortable Newport Beach home, not out of dependence, but out of genuine love and closeness with her family. The Hubers were tight-knit, the kind of family that actually enjoyed spending time together. Dennis worked hard to provide for his family, while Ione managed their home with the grace and warmth that made everyone feel welcome. Denise had recently graduated from college and was beginning to navigate the exciting uncertainty of early adulthood. She had dreams, ambitions, and plans for the future. She loved music, particularly alternative rock, and wasn't afraid to drive long distances to see her favorite bands perform. This passion for live music was something that brought her joy, a way to escape the mundane routines of daily life and lose herself in the energy of a crowd and the power of a great performance. The summer of 1991 started like any other for the Hubers. Denise was working, spending time with friends, and enjoying the freedom that came with being a young adult in one of California's most desirable locations. The beaches were crowded with tourists, the weather was perfect, and life seemed full of endless possibilities. None of them could have imagined that this perfect life was about to be shattered in the most unthinkable way. June 3, 1991, was a Monday night that started with anticipation and excitement. Denise had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. Morrissey, the enigmatic former lead singer of the Smiths, was performing at the Forum in Inglewood, and Denise was determined not to miss it. Morrissey was at the height of his solo career in 1991. His brooding, poetic lyrics and dramatic stage presence had earned him a devoted following, particularly among young people who felt disconnected from mainstream culture. For fans like Denise, attending a Morrissey concert wasn't just entertainment. It was an experience, a chance to be part of something meaningful and emotionally powerful. The Forum in Inglewood was about an hour's drive from Newport Beach, depending on traffic. It was a journey Denise had made before for other concerts, and she was comfortable making the drive alone. She had a reliable car, she knew the route well, and she was an experienced driver. Her parents weren't worried, after all. This was just another night out for their responsible, capable daughter. The concert itself was everything Denise had hoped for. Morrissey was in fine form, delivering his signature blend of melancholy and passion to a crowd that hung on his every word. The audience sang along to classics like Suede Head and Every Day is Like Sunday, their voices rising in unison in the darkened arena. For a few hours, Denise was transported from her everyday concerns into a world of music and shared emotion. As the concert wound down and the lights came up, Denise felt that familiar post-show euphoria mixed with a touch of sadness that it was over. She made her way through the crowds, past the merchandise stands and out into the parking lot, where hundreds of other concertgoers were beginning their journeys home. The time was approaching 2 a.m. when Denise finally made it to her car and began the drive back to Newport Beach. The freeways were relatively empty at this hour, with only the occasional late-night traveler sharing the road. It should have been a peaceful, reflective drive home, a chance to replay the highlights of the concert in her mind as she navigated the familiar route. Instead, it would be the last drive Denise Huber would ever take. The Corona del Mar freeway stretched ahead of Denise in the early morning darkness. This section of road was well known to locals, a major artery connecting the inland areas to the coast. At 2 a.m., it was mostly deserted, with only the occasional pair of headlights breaking the monotony of the empty lanes. Denise was less than 3 miles from home when she heard the sound no driver wants to hear, a loud pop followed by the unmistakable thump-thump-thump of a flat tire. She could feel her car pulling to one side as the deflated rear tire made the vehicle difficult to control. There was nothing to do but pull over to the shoulder and assess the situation. She guided her car to the right side of the freeway and came to a stop. The silence after turning off the engine was deafening. She stepped out into the cool night air and confirmed what she already knew. Her rear tire had blown completely. In the darkness, she could see the shredded remains of rubber scattered on the asphalt behind her car. For a young woman alone on a dark freeway at 2 a.m., this was far from an ideal situation. But Denise was practical and level-headed. She had a spare tire in her trunk, and she had changed tires before. It wouldn't be pleasant work in the dark, but it was certainly manageable. She popped the trunk and began gathering the tools she would need. What Denise didn't know was that she was not alone on that stretch of freeway. Another vehicle had also been traveling the Corona del Mar freeway that night, and its driver had noticed the young woman pulled over on the side of the road. This driver had a decision to make. He could continue on his way, leaving Denise to handle her car trouble alone. He could stop and offer assistance, playing the role of a good Samaritan helping a stranded motorist. Or he could stop with much darker intentions. As Denise worked to change her tire, focused on the task at hand and eager to get back on the road and home to safety, she had no way of knowing that her life was about to intersect with one of the most dangerous predators in California. The vehicle slowed and pulled up behind her disabled car. When Dennis and Ione Huber woke up on the morning of June 4th, they expected to find their daughter either still sleeping after her late night out or perhaps already up and getting ready for the day. Instead, they found an empty house and a growing sense of unease. Denise's bed hadn't been slept in. Her purse, keys, and the various personal items she always brought with her were nowhere to be found. This was completely unlike their daughter, who was reliable and considerate, always letting her parents know if she was going to be late or staying somewhere else for the night. Dennis called Denise's friends, hoping to find that she had decided to crash at someone's place after the concert rather than make the long drive home. But none of them had seen her since before the show. They had all driven separately and hadn't made plans to meet up afterward. As the hours passed, the Hubers' concern turned to genuine fear. They called hospitals, thinking perhaps she had been in an accident. They called the police, though officers initially suggested that a 23-year-old woman staying out all night wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. But Dennis and Ione knew their daughter, and they knew something was terribly wrong. By late afternoon, they decided to retrace Denise's route home from the concert. Dennis drove while Ione kept her eyes peeled for any sign of their daughter or her car. The freeways were busy with rush-hour traffic, making their search difficult, but they persevered. It was Ione who spotted at first Denise's Honda Civic sitting on the shoulder of the Corona del Mar freeway, exactly where she had broken down the night before. The car was empty, the doors were unlocked, and the spare tire and jack were scattered on the ground beside it, as if Denise had been in the middle of changing the tire when something interrupted her. The scene told a story, but it wasn't a complete one. Clearly, Denise had been changing her tire when something happened. But what? Had someone stopped to help her and offered her a ride? Had she been the victim of a crime? Or had she simply accepted assistance from someone and forgotten to call home? The Costa Mesa Police Department began their investigation immediately. They processed the scene, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened to Denise Huber. They interviewed other drivers who might have been on that stretch of freeway around the time Denise disappeared. They checked with local hospitals, morgues, and police departments in surrounding areas. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, the investigation seemed to hit wall after wall. There were no witnesses to Denise's disappearance, no clear evidence of foul play beyond the abandoned car, and no leads that seemed to go anywhere meaningful. The disappearance of Denise Huber became a cause célèbre in Orange County. Her parents, desperate for answers, threw themselves into the search for their daughter with an intensity that was both inspiring and heartbreaking to witness. Dennis and Ione Huber became familiar faces on local news programs, pleading for information about their daughter's whereabouts. They organized search parties, distributed missing person flyers, and followed up on every tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed. They refused to give up hope, even as months passed without any meaningful developments. The case attracted significant media attention, partly because of the mysterious circumstances of Denise's disappearance, and partly because she represented every parent's worst nightmare, a responsible young adult who simply vanished without a trace. Local newspapers ran regular updates on the investigation, and television news programs periodically revisited the story. Detective Jack Archer of the Costa Mesa Police Department became the lead investigator on the case, and he approached it with the thoroughness and dedication that such a puzzling disappearance demanded. He interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on countless tips, and pursued every possible lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The investigation considered many possibilities. Perhaps Denise had been the victim of a random crime, a robbery gone wrong, or a sexual assault. Perhaps she had been kidnapped by someone who specifically targeted her. Or perhaps she had suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency after leaving her car and was lying injured somewhere, unable to call for help. Months turned into years, and still there were no answers. The Hoobers never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, never stopped believing that somehow, somewhere, they would find their daughter. But as time passed, even the most optimistic observers began to fear the worst. The case grew cold, but it was never forgotten. Detective Archer continued to work on it whenever new information surfaced, and the Hoobers continued to keep their daughter's story in the public eye. They established a reward fund, hoping that financial incentive might motivate someone with information to come forward. What none of them knew was that Denise Huber was indeed dead, and had been since the night she disappeared. More shocking still, her body was traveling around the American Southwest in the back of a rental truck, frozen in a makeshift morgue constructed by her killer. To understand what happened to Denise Huber on that dark freeway in June 1991, we need to understand the man who killed her. John Joseph Famularo was 38 years old at the time of Denise's murder, and he had been living a carefully constructed double life for years. On the surface, Famularo appeared to be a relatively normal, if somewhat unremarkable, middle-aged man. He worked as a house painter and handyman, jobs that allowed him to work independently and avoid too much scrutiny from employers or coworkers. He was polite in his interactions with others, the kind of person who could blend into a crowd without attracting attention. But beneath this mundane exterior lurked a deeply disturbed individual with a long history of violence against women. Famularo had been married previously, and that marriage had ended after incidents of domestic violence. He had a pattern of controlling behavior, explosive anger, and sexual aggression that had escalated over the years. In the months leading up to his encounter with Denise Huber, Famularo had been living in a warehouse space in Laguna Hills, California. This wasn't a traditional apartment or house, but rather a commercial space that he had converted into living quarters. The isolation of this location suited him perfectly. It was private. It was removed from the scrutiny of neighbors, and it provided him with the space he needed for his increasingly dark fantasies. Famularo had been trolling the freeways at night, looking for opportunities. He was particularly drawn to scenarios where young women might be vulnerable, broken down cars, flat tires, mechanical problems that might leave someone stranded and in need of assistance. He had likely done this many times before, though Denise Huber would be his first known victim. On the night of June 3, 1991, Famularo was driving the Corona del Mar freeway when he spotted Denise changing her tire on the shoulder of the road. Here was exactly the opportunity he had been looking for: a young, attractive woman, alone and vulnerable, far from help. He pulled his vehicle up behind her car and got out, likely approaching her under the pretense of offering assistance. Denise, raised to be polite and perhaps relieved to have help with her car trouble, probably welcomed what appeared to be a good Samaritan. What happened next would haunt investigators and the Huber family for years to come. The exact details of what happened to Denise Huber on the Corona del Mar freeway that night are known only through the physical evidence left behind in Famularo's eventual confession. But the story that emerged was one of unfathomable cruelty and violence. Famularo didn't stop to help Denise with her tire. Instead, he abducted her, likely using force or the threat of force to get her into his vehicle. He then drove her to his warehouse space in Laguna Hills, where he held her captive. What Denise endured in that warehouse is difficult to describe, but the evidence suggests that her final hours were filled with terror and pain. Famularo sexually assaulted her repeatedly, and the physical evidence indicated that the attack was prolonged and brutal. He then murdered her, beating her to death with a hammer and crowbar in a frenzy of violence that spoke to his complete lack of humanity. But Famillaro's crimes didn't end with Denise's death. In what would become the most disturbing aspect of an already horrific case, he decided to keep her body as a trophy. He purchased a large freezer and placed Denise's remains inside, preserving them like some grotesque memento of his crime. For 3 years, John Famillaro lived with Denise Huber's frozen corpse. He moved from place to place, always careful to bring the freezer with him. When he relocated from California to Arizona in 1994, he loaded the freezer into a large rental truck and transported his victim across state lines. This was not the behavior of someone who had committed a crime of passion or made a terrible mistake. This was the calculated action of a deeply disturbed individual who derived some kind of sick satisfaction from keeping his victim close to him. The freezer became a shrine to his violence, a way for him to relive and extend his control over Denise even after her death. Meanwhile, Denise's parents continued their desperate search, never knowing that their daughter's body was being carted around the Southwest by her killer. The irony was both tragic and infuriating. While the Hubers organized search parties and followed up on tips from psychics and well-meaning strangers, their daughter was hidden in plain sight, traveling the highways in the back of a rental truck. After murdering Denise Huber, John Famillaro attempted to build a new life for himself in Arizona, far from the scene of his crime. He settled in Yavapai County, near Prescott, in a rural area where neighbors were few and questions were rare. He found work as a house painter and handyman, the same type of independent labor that had served him well in California. To his new Arizona neighbors, Famillaro appeared to be just another transplant from California, seeking a quieter life in the high desert. He kept to himself mostly, but was polite and professional in his business dealings. He bought and sold paint at local markets, did odd jobs for homeowners, and gradually established himself as a reliable if unremarkable member of the community. But Famillaro was carrying a dark secret with him. The large yellow Ryder rental truck that sat in his driveway wasn't just storage space for his painting equipment and household goods. Hidden inside that truck, plugged into an electrical outlet and humming quietly day and night, was the freezer containing Denise Huber's body. The psychological implications of Famillaro's behavior during this period are staggering. For 3 years, he went about his daily routine, waking up, eating breakfast, going to work, interacting with customers and neighbors, all while knowing that the decomposing remains of his victim were just a few yards away. The freezer had become such a normal part of his environment that he seemed to have integrated it seamlessly into his life. This wasn't someone racked with guilt or living in constant fear of discovery. This was someone who had compartmentalized his crime so completely that he could function normally while literally living with the evidence of his most heinous act. The freezer wasn't hidden in some remote location or buried in the desert. It was right there in his driveway, connected to his house's electrical system, requiring daily maintenance to keep it running. Neighbors occasionally noticed the rental truck, but in rural Arizona, people minded their own business. If anyone was curious about why Famillaro needed such a large truck for so long, they kept their questions to themselves. The truck became part of the landscape, as unremarkable as any other piece of equipment a working man might need. But secrets, especially ones as dark as Famillaro's, have a way of revealing themselves at the most unexpected moments. July 9th, 1994, started as an ordinary day for Elaine Court. She was a local woman who occasionally bought paint from John Famillaro at one of the markets where he sold his supplies. On this particular day, she needed paint for a home project and decided to drive out to Famillaro's house to make a purchase. Famillaro's property was typical for the area, a modest house on a large lot, surrounded by the high desert landscape of Yavapai County. As Court pulled into the driveway, she noticed the large yellow Ryder truck that had been parked there for months. But on this day, something about the truck struck her as wrong. Later, Court would describe the feeling as spiritual, almost otherworldly. She felt what she described as a spirit pulling at her, compelling her to pay attention to the truck. There was something about its presence that seemed ominous, out of place, even malevolent. The feeling was so strong that it made her uncomfortable, and she found herself unable to shake the sense that something terrible was hidden inside that truck. After completing her business with Famularo and leaving his property, Court couldn't stop thinking about the truck and the strange feeling it had given her. The sensation was so powerful and persistent that she decided she had to act on it. She contacted the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department and reported her suspicions. To their credit, the sheriff's deputies took Court's report seriously. While a feeling about a rental truck might not have constituted probable cause for a search warrant in most circumstances, there was something about Court's certainty and the details of her account that convinced investigators to look into the matter further. On July 13, 1994, deputies arrived at Famularo's property with a search warrant. Famularo was cooperative, even friendly, as officers explained that they wanted to search his premises as part of a routine investigation. He seemed confident that there was nothing for them to find, perhaps believing that his secret had remained hidden for so long that it would continue to remain hidden forever. The deputies began their search with the house, looking through rooms and storage areas for anything suspicious. They found nothing out of the ordinary, the home of a single man living a simple life in rural Arizona. Then they turned their attention to the yellow Ryder truck. The deputies approached the rental truck with no clear idea of what they might find inside. The truck was locked, and Famularo initially claimed he didn't have the key, but eventually produced it when pressed by officers. The back door rolled up with the metallic screech typical of such trucks. At first glance, the interior looked like what you might expect from someone using a rental truck for storage: boxes, furniture, household items, and equipment stacked and organized throughout the cargo area. But as deputies began to examine the contents more closely, they noticed something unusual. In the far corner of the truck, plugged into a heavy-duty extension cord that snaked out through a small gap in the truck's door, sat a large white freezer. The freezer was humming quietly, clearly operational and maintaining its temperature even in the Arizona heat. This struck the officers as odd. Why would someone need to keep a freezer running in a rental truck? Deputy Sheriff Frank Kistler approached the freezer and lifted the lid. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his career. Curled up in the fetal position, handcuffed and frozen solid, was the body of a young woman. She was wearing jeans and a concert t-shirt, her blonde hair matted with blood. Even in her frozen state, it was clear that she had suffered severe trauma to her head and face. The deputies immediately secured the scene and called for backup, including homicide investigators and the coroner's office. Famularo was placed under arrest, though at this point, officers had no idea who the victim was or how long she had been dead. The freezer had preserved the body so well that the woman looked as though she might have died recently, rather than 3 years earlier. This would initially complicate the investigation, as the level of preservation made it difficult to determine time of death through normal forensic methods. As investigators began processing the scene, they found other disturbing evidence throughout the truck. There were notebooks containing detailed descriptions of Famularo's violent fantasies, photographs of women taken without their knowledge, and other materials that painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual who had been planning and fantasizing about violence for years. But the most important piece of evidence was the victim herself. Until investigators could determine who she was and how she had come to be in that freezer, they couldn't begin to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. The answer to that question would come soon enough, and it would connect this Arizona crime scene to a missing person case that had baffled California investigators for 3 long years. The process of identifying the frozen body found in John Famularo's truck required both cutting-edge forensic techniques and old-fashioned detective work. The preservation caused by the freezer had maintained the body in remarkable condition, but it also presented unique challenges for investigators. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office, unaccustomed to dealing with frozen remains, had to carefully thaw the body using hair dryers to avoid damaging potential evidence, particularly fingerprints. It was delicate work that required patience and precision. Once the body was properly thawed, fingerprints were taken and run through various databases. The prints didn't match anyone in the Arizona system, suggesting that this wasn't a local victim. Investigators expanded their search to neighboring states, eventually running the prints through California's database. The match came back quickly. Denise Huber, missing from Newport Beach since June 3, 1991. The identification sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Detective Jack Archer, who had been working the Huber case for over 3 years, received the call from Arizona with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the family would finally have answers. Horror at what those answers revealed about Denise's fate. The connection between the Arizona discovery and the California missing person case immediately elevated the investigation to a multi-state homicide. California authorities worked closely with their Arizona counterparts to piece together the timeline and gather evidence. For Dennis and Ione Huber, the news was devastating but also brought a kind of closure they had been seeking for years. Their daughter was dead, as they had increasingly feared, but at least they knew what had happened to her. The uncertainty that had plagued them for 3 years was finally over, replaced by the difficult process of grieving for their daughter and seeking justice for her killer. The media attention that had surrounded Denise's disappearance intensified with the discovery of her body. The details of the case, the random abduction, the prolonged captivity of the remains, the cross-state transportation of evidence, captured public attention in a way that few crimes do. John Famularo was quickly dubbed the Icebox Killer by the press, a nickname that emphasized the most disturbing aspect of his crimes. With Denise Huber's body identified and John Famularo in custody, investigators from California and Arizona began the complex process of building a case that would span multiple jurisdictions and involve evidence that was 3 years old. Forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginetti was brought in to examine Denise's remains and determine the cause of death. Despite the preservation caused by freezing, the extensive trauma to her skull was clearly visible. The examination revealed that she had been beaten repeatedly with both a hammer and a crowbar, weapons that were subsequently found among Famularo's possessions. The brutality of the attack was shocking even to experienced investigators. The number and severity of the injuries suggested a prolonged and frenzied assault, indicative of someone who had completely lost control or who derived satisfaction from inflicting pain and suffering. Physical evidence from the freezer and the rental truck provided additional clues about what had happened to Denise. The handcuffs that bound her wrists were traced back to a sporting goods store where Famularo had made purchases. Hair and fiber evidence linked him to the crime scene. Most damning of all, Famularo's own notebooks contained detailed descriptions of his fantasies about abducting and killing young women. The investigation also revealed the extent of Famularo's preparation and premeditation. He had clearly been planning crimes like this for some time, trolling the freeways looking for vulnerable victims. Denise had simply been unlucky enough to break down at the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with a predator who had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity. Investigators worked to establish a timeline of Famularo's movements in the 3 years between Denise's murder and the discovery of her body. They found that he had moved frequently, always taking the freezer with him, always careful to maintain the electrical connection that kept his gruesome trophy preserved. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of someone who was not just a killer, but someone who derived ongoing satisfaction from maintaining control over his victim even after death. The freezer wasn't just a way to hide evidence. It was a shrine that allowed Famularo to relive his crime over and over again. The prosecution of John Famularo for the murder of Denise Huber presented unique challenges for both the legal system and the investigators involved. The crime had been committed in California, but the evidence had been discovered in Arizona, creating jurisdictional issues that required careful coordination between the two states. Ultimately, it was decided that Famularo would be tried in California, where the murder had actually taken place. He was extradited back to Orange County, where he would face charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances that made him eligible for the death penalty. The special circumstances included the fact that the murder was committed during the course of a kidnapping, and that Famularo had sexually assaulted Denise before killing her. These aggravating factors, combined with the particularly heinous nature of the crime, made this a capital case from the beginning. Famularo's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his own writings had documented his violent fantasies in disturbing detail. Their best hope was to avoid the death penalty by arguing for mental illness or diminished capacity. The prosecution, led by the Orange County District Attorney's Office, methodically presented the evidence against Famularo. They walked the jury through the timeline of events, from Denise's breakdown on the freeway to the discovery of her body in Arizona 3 years later. They presented the forensic evidence, the witness testimony, and Famularo's own words from his notebooks and journals. Perhaps most powerfully, they humanized Denise Huber for the jury. They showed photos of her life, heard testimony from her parents about the kind of person she was, and helped the jury understand that this wasn't just a case about evidence and legal procedures. This was about a young woman whose life had been brutally cut short by a predator who had shown no mercy and no remorse. The trial was emotionally devastating for the Huber family, who had to relive the worst period of their lives in excruciating detail. But they were determined to see justice done for their daughter, and they attended every day of proceedings, providing a visible reminder of the human cost of Famularo's crimes. The jury in John Famularo's trial deliberated for several days before reaching their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Dennis and Ione Huber sat in the front row, holding hands as they waited to hear whether their daughter's killer would be held accountable for his crimes. The verdict was guilty on all counts, first-degree murder with special circumstances. The jury had found that Famularo had kidnapped Denise Huber, sexually assaulted her, and then murdered her in a crime so heinous that it warranted the ultimate penalty under California law. In the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury would have to decide whether Famularo should receive life in prison without parole or death. The prosecution argued that the particularly cruel and depraved nature of the crime, combined with Famularo's lack of remorse and the ongoing trauma he had inflicted on the victim's family, warranted the death penalty. The defense argued for life imprisonment, citing Famularo's troubled background and suggesting that his mental illness should be considered as a mitigating factor. They painted a picture of a man who was deeply disturbed and needed treatment rather than execution. But the jury was not swayed by these arguments. After considering all the evidence and testimony, they recommended that John Joseph Famularo be sentenced to death for the murder of Denise Huber. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Famularo to death. He would join the hundreds of other condemned inmates on California's death row, awaiting the appeals process that would likely take years or even decades to complete. For Dennis and Ione Huber, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring back their daughter or erase the trauma they had endured. They had spent 3 years not knowing what had happened to Denise, followed by the horror of learning the truth about her final hours. The trial had forced them to relive those terrible events in public, but at least they knew that her killer would never hurt anyone else. The case had a broader impact as well, highlighting the vulnerability of motorists who break down on isolated highways and the importance of taking precautions in such situations. It also demonstrated the value of listening to intuition. If Elaine Court hadn't trusted her instincts about that rental truck, Denise's body might never have been found, and her killer might have escaped justice entirely. The murder of Denise Huber represents one of those crimes that stays with you long after you've heard the details. It's not just the brutality of what happened to her, though that was certainly shocking. It's not just the randomness of her selection as a victim, though that was terrifying in its implications. What makes this case so haunting is the way it reveals the absolute depths of human depravity and the thin line that separates our normal, everyday lives from unthinkable horror. Denise Huber was living the kind of life that millions of young people live every day. She went to concerts. She lived with her parents. She had dreams and plans for the future. On the night she died, she was doing something completely ordinary, driving home from a show she had enjoyed. When her car broke down, she did what any practical person would do. She pulled over and prepared to change the tire herself. In those final moments before John Famularo appeared behind her, Denise was probably thinking about normal things. Maybe she was replaying her favorite songs from the concert, or thinking about what she had to do the next day, or feeling a little frustrated about the flat tire but confident she could handle it. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to intersect with someone who represented the very worst of humanity. The 3 years that Famularo kept her body preserved in that freezer represent a level of psychological disturbance that most of us can't begin to comprehend. This wasn't someone who killed in a moment of passion or rage and then tried to hide the evidence. This was someone who turned his victim into a macabre trophy, a constant reminder of his power over another human being. For Dennis and Ione Huber, the discovery of their daughter's fate brought the closure they had desperately needed, but it also brought a pain that no parent should ever have to endure. They learned not only that their beloved daughter was dead, but that she had suffered terribly in her final hours and that her remains had been desecrated for years by the man who killed her. Yet through their unimaginable grief, the Hubers found a way to honor their daughter's memory. They became advocates for victims' rights, working to ensure that other families wouldn't have to endure the same long period of uncertainty they had faced. They pushed for better communication between law enforcement agencies and for improved resources for families of missing persons. The case also served as a stark reminder of the importance of personal safety, particularly for young people traveling alone at night. While we can't live our lives in constant fear, Denise's story underscores the reality that predators do exist, and they often target people who appear vulnerable or isolated. Detective Jack Archer, who had worked tirelessly on the case for 3 years, later reflected that the Denise Huber investigation was both the most challenging and the most important case of his career. The fact that her family never gave up hope, never stopped searching, never stopped believing that she would be found, had motivated him to continue pursuing every lead, no matter how cold the case seemed to grow. The discovery of Denise's body in that Arizona truck was ultimately the result of one woman's intuition and courage. Elaine Court could have ignored the strange feeling she had about that rental truck, could have dismissed it as imagination or paranoia. Instead, she trusted her instincts and contacted law enforcement, setting in motion the chain of events that would finally bring John Famularo to justice. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's worth remembering that behind all the legal proceedings, forensic evidence, and media attention was a real person whose life was cut short far too soon. Denise Huber was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had her whole future ahead of her when she encountered John Famularo on that dark freeway. Her story serves as a reminder that evil can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time, but it also demonstrates the power of love, persistence, and the refusal to give up hope. Her parents never stopped looking for her, investigators never stopped working her case, and ultimately, justice was served. John Famularo remains on death row in California, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. The appeals process continues, as it does for all capital cases, but his conviction has never been seriously challenged. The evidence against him was simply too overwhelming, and the nature of his crimes too heinous, for there to be any real doubt about his guilt. Denise Huber was finally laid to rest in 1994, 3 years after her death, surrounded by family and friends who had never stopped loving her or hoping for her return. Her grave serves as a peaceful place where those who knew her can remember the vibrant, kind, music-loving young woman she was, rather than the victim she became. And on quiet nights, when the freeways of Southern California stretch empty under the stars, it's easy to imagine that somewhere out there, Denise Huber's spirit finally found the peace that was so cruelly taken from her on that June night in 1991. Her story will not be forgotten. It serves as both a warning and a testament, a warning about the dangers that can lurk in the most ordinary moments, and a testament to the unbreakable bonds of family love and the ultimate power of truth to prevail over darkness. Rest in peace, Denise Huber. Your story has been told, your killer brought to justice, and your memory preserved in the hearts of all who knew you and all who have learned your story. The case of Denise Huber reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when hope seems lost and justice seems impossible, the truth has a way of emerging. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it requires the courage of strangers, and sometimes it demands more strength than any family should have to summon. But eventually, if we refuse to give up, the truth will find its way into the light. And with that truth comes the possibility of healing, the promise of justice, and the assurance that those we love are never truly forgotten. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet desert community of Palmdale, California, where the Antelope Valley stretches endlessly beneath wide skies, there lived a little boy named Gabriel Fernandez. Born on February 20th, 2005, Gabriel came into this world during a time when his mother, Pearl, was struggling with her own demons and difficulties. This is the story of Gabriel's short life and the tragic events that would shake not only his family, but an entire community and child welfare system. Gabriel's story begins not with his mother, but with his great-uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and his partner David Martinez. For the first 4 years of Gabriel's life, these two men provided him with the love, stability, and care that every child deserves. In their home, Gabriel was a normal, happy little boy who played, laughed, and grew in an environment filled with warmth and protection. Michael and David had taken Gabriel in when he was just a baby, stepping in when Pearl Fernandez was unable to care for him herself. Pearl, then in her early 20s, was dealing with her own complex issues and wasn't ready for the responsibilities of motherhood. The arrangement seemed to work well for everyone involved. Gabriel thrived under his great-uncle's care, attending preschool, making friends, and living the carefree life that childhood should offer. But in 2012, when Gabriel was 7 years old, everything changed. Pearl Fernandez made the decision to reclaim custody of her son. The reasons for this decision would later become a subject of much speculation and investigation. Some would suggest it was motivated by the welfare benefits that came with having a child in her care. Others believed she genuinely wanted to try again at being a mother. Whatever her motivations, the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services approved the transition, and Gabriel left the only stable home he had ever known. Michael and David were heartbroken. They had petitioned for custody, wanting to continue providing Gabriel with the loving home he deserved. But the system favored biological parents, and despite their pleas and the clear evidence of Gabriel's happiness in their care, the boy was sent to live with his mother in Palmdale. When Gabriel arrived at his mother's apartment on East Avenue Q, 10 in Palmdale, he entered a world that was vastly different from the one he had known. Pearl Fernandez was now living with her boyfriend, Isoro Aguirre, a man whose presence would prove to be devastating for the young boy. Isoro Aguirre was a troubled individual with his own dark history. He had spent time in prison and carried with him a particular hatred that would soon focus itself on Gabriel. For reasons that mental health professionals would later try to understand, Aguirre seemed to believe that Gabriel was gay, and this perceived sexuality triggered a violent homophobic rage within him. The apartment where Gabriel now lived was crowded. Pearl had other children from previous relationships, and the household was chaotic and unstable. Almost immediately, Gabriel began to experience treatment that was markedly different from what he had known with his great-uncle. The warm, protective environment was replaced with hostility, neglect, and increasingly severe punishment. Pearl's own relationship with Gabriel was complex and troubling. She seemed unable or unwilling to protect him from Aguirre's growing violence. Whether out of fear, indifference, or her own participation in the abuse, Pearl would ultimately become complicit in what was to come. What began as harsh discipline quickly escalated into systematic torture. Gabriel, now attending Summerwind Elementary School, began showing signs that deeply concerned his teachers and classmates. He would arrive at school with visible injuries, bruises, cuts, and marks that he would try to explain away with stories of accidents and falls. The abuse took many forms, each more horrific than the last. Gabriel was regularly beaten with various objects including belt buckles, a baseball bat, and coat hangers. He was shot with BB guns, sprayed with pepper spray, and forced to eat cat feces. He was often locked in a small cabinet for hours at a time, sometimes overnight, and was denied basic necessities like food and access to the bathroom. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the psychological torture. Aguirre would force Gabriel to dress in girls' clothing and present himself as gay to other family members and visitors. The abuse was not only physical but designed to humiliate and break the boy's spirit. Gabriel was often called names, told he was worthless, and made to believe that the abuse was somehow his fault. The other children in the household witnessed much of this abuse, living in an atmosphere of terror themselves. They were threatened not to tell anyone what was happening, creating a conspiracy of silence that would allow the torture to continue undetected for months. Gabriel's situation at school became increasingly alarming to those who interacted with him daily. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, noticed dramatic changes in the boy's behavior and appearance. Gabriel, who had once been a bright, cheerful child, became withdrawn and fearful. He would flinch when adults approached him, and his academic performance suffered as he struggled to concentrate through the trauma he was experiencing at home. The school reported their concerns to the Department of Children and Family Services multiple times. Social workers visited the home, but somehow, Pearl and Aguirre managed to convince them that everything was fine. Gabriel, terrified of what would happen if he told the truth, would support their lies during these visits. This failure of the system would later become one of the most controversial aspects of Gabriel's case. From 2003 to 2012, over 60 complaints were filed against Pearl Fernandez and her boyfriend, Isoro Aguirre. These complaints prompted 8 investigations by both Los Angeles County Child Protective Services and the Department of Children and Family Services. Yet somehow Gabriel remained in their care. The investigations were superficial at best. Social workers would arrive, conduct brief interviews, and leave without thoroughly examining the living conditions or the children's physical state. The system that was supposed to protect Gabriel was failing him at every turn, while the abuse at home continued to escalate. Gabriel's great-uncle Michael continued to fight for custody, making numerous calls to Child Protective Services and pleading for them to remove Gabriel from the home. He could see the changes in his great-nephew during the rare visits that were allowed, and his heart broke knowing that the child he had raised with such love was suffering. Among the few bright spots in Gabriel's increasingly dark world were the teachers and staff at Summerwind Elementary School who genuinely cared about his welfare. Jennifer Garcia, his teacher, went above and beyond what was required, documenting Gabriel's injuries and repeatedly reporting her concerns to the proper authorities. The school nurse also became concerned about Gabriel's condition. She photographed his injuries and created a record that would later become crucial evidence in the case. These dedicated professionals were often the only adults in Gabriel's life who showed him kindness and concern during this period. Gabriel began to confide in some of his teachers about what was happening at home, though he was often too frightened to tell the complete truth. He would hint at the abuse, saying that his mother and her boyfriend were mean to him, but the full extent of the horror he was experiencing remained hidden. The school's efforts to help Gabriel were hampered by a system that seemed designed to keep families together regardless of the circumstances. Despite their repeated reports and documented evidence of abuse, Gabriel remained in the home where his torture continued to intensify. As 2013 began, Gabriel's condition deteriorated rapidly. The abuse became more frequent and more severe. Aguirre's violence seemed to know no bounds, and Pearl's participation in the abuse became more active. She would later be described by prosecutors as not just a passive witness to her boyfriend's cruelty, but an active participant in her son's torture. Gabriel's physical appearance became shocking to those who saw him. He was malnourished, covered in bruises and cuts, and walked with the cautious gait of someone who expected to be hurt at any moment. His teeth were knocked out, his face was swollen from repeated beatings, and his small body bore the evidence of systematic abuse. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Gabriel began exhibiting signs of severe trauma. He would have nightmares, wet the bed, and show extreme fearfulness around adults. His personality, once bright and outgoing, had been crushed under the weight of constant abuse and terror. During this time, Gabriel made several attempts to get help. He told his teacher that he wanted to die, a statement that should have triggered immediate intervention. He drew pictures that depicted violence and wrote notes asking for help. Each cry for help was documented and reported, but somehow the system continued to fail him. In May 2013, the abuse reached its horrific climax. Aguirre and Pearl Fernandez's abuse and torture of the boy came to a head on May 22, 2013, when the child stopped breathing after he was attacked with a BB gun, pepper spray, coat hangers, and a wooden baseball bat. On that terrible day, What began as another episode of abuse escalated beyond even the extreme violence Gabriel had already endured. The details of what happened in that apartment are difficult to contemplate. Gabriel was beaten so severely that his body could no longer sustain the trauma. Pearl Fernandez would later call 911, claiming that Gabriel had fallen and hit his head. Reports indicate that on May 22, 2013, Pearl called 911 to report that her child, Gabriel Fernandez, was not breathing. When the first responders arrived, they discovered him on the ground naked with several injuries. When paramedics arrived at the apartment on East Avenue Q, 10, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. When paramedics arrived, they found a bruised and beaten Gabriel. The child was unconscious, barely breathing, and his small body showed evidence of prolonged and severe abuse. The first responders immediately recognized that this was no accident. Gabriel's injuries were consistent with systematic torture, not a fall as Pearl had claimed. His body was covered in bruises of various ages, indicating that the abuse had been ongoing for an extended period. Gabriel was rushed to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where medical staff worked desperately to save his life, but the damage was too severe. He was declared brain dead that day and taken off life support 2 days later. Gabriel died at Children's Hospital Los Angeles on May 24, 2013, just 3 months after his 8th birthday. The little boy who had once been so full of life and joy was gone, a victim of the very people who should have protected him. On May 23, 2013, Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre were arrested. Fernandez was arrested for felony child endangerment while Aguirre was arrested for attempted murder. As the investigation unfolded, the true scope of Gabriel's suffering became apparent. Detectives interviewed the other children in the home, who finally felt safe enough to tell the truth about what they had witnessed. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic torture that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. The children described how Gabriel was regularly beaten, starved, and humiliated in ways that defied comprehension. The investigation also revealed the numerous failures of the child welfare system. Social workers who had visited the home were questioned about their observations and decisions. The reports they had filed were scrutinized, and a pattern of negligence and incompetence emerged. Gabriel's great-uncle Michael was interviewed extensively. His pain and frustration were evident as he described his efforts to regain custody of Gabriel and his repeated attempts to alert authorities about the abuse. His testimony would become crucial in understanding how the system had failed to protect Gabriel despite numerous warning signs. The autopsy results were horrific. Gabriel's body showed evidence of systematic abuse over an extended period. He had suffered numerous fractures, internal injuries, and trauma that spoke to months of torture. The medical examiner determined that Gabriel had died from blunt force trauma to the head, but his body bore evidence of countless other injuries that had been inflicted over time. The medical evidence also revealed signs of malnourishment and neglect. Gabriel had been denied adequate food, medical care, and basic human needs. His small body had endured pain and suffering that no child should ever experience. Forensic experts examined the apartment where Gabriel lived, finding evidence of the abuse throughout the home. Bloodstains, damaged walls, and other physical evidence corroborated the testimonies of the witnesses and painted a picture of a home where violence was routine. On May 28, 2013, Pearl Fernandez and Aguirre were charged with capital murder in Gabriel's death. The charges reflected the severity of Gabriel's suffering and the premeditated nature of the abuse he had endured. The legal proceedings would take years to unfold, during which time Gabriel's story gained national attention. The case became a symbol of the failures of child protective services and sparked widespread calls for reform. Prosecutors faced the challenging task of presenting evidence that was both horrific and necessary to secure convictions. The testimony of the other children in the home, medical evidence, and documentation from Gabriel's school painted a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse and torture. The defense attorneys for both Pearl and Aguirre attempted various strategies to minimize their clients' culpability, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The case garnered significant media attention, with many following the proceedings closely and hoping for justice for Gabriel. Isoro Aguirre's trial began first, and the evidence presented against him was damning. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and guilty of the circumstances of torture charges. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Aguirre was sentenced to death for his role in Gabriel's torture and murder. Pearl Fernandez's case followed a different path. Aguirre was sentenced to be executed and Fernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her sentence reflected her role not just as a passive witness to the abuse, but as an active participant in her son's torture. The convictions brought some measure of justice for Gabriel, but they could never undo the suffering he had endured or bring back the bright, loving child who had been lost to such senseless violence. Gabriel's case exposed significant failures within the Los Angeles County child welfare system. Multiple social workers who had been assigned to Gabriel's case faced scrutiny for their handling of the reports and investigations. Some faced criminal charges themselves for their negligence. The case led to widespread calls for reform in how child abuse cases are investigated and handled. New protocols were put in place to ensure that social workers receive better training and that cases involving suspected abuse are more thoroughly investigated. Gabriel's story became a catalyst for change, highlighting the need for better communication between schools, law enforcement, and child protective services. His death, while tragic, led to reforms that may prevent similar tragedies in the future. In the years following Gabriel's death, his story continued to resonate with people around the world. A Netflix documentary series, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, brought renewed attention to his case and the systemic failures that contributed to his death. Gabriel's great-uncle Michael and his partner David continued to advocate for reform and to keep Gabriel's memory alive. They established foundations and spoke publicly about the need for better protection of vulnerable children. The case also sparked broader conversations about child abuse, the signs that adults should watch for, and the responsibility we all share to protect children who cannot protect themselves. Gabriel Fernandez lived only 8 years, but his story continues to have impact years after his death. He was a child who deserved love, protection, and the chance to grow up and fulfill his potential. Instead, he suffered unimaginable abuse at the hands of those who should have cared for him most. The tragedy of Gabriel's story lies not only in his suffering and death, but in how preventable it all was. There were numerous opportunities for intervention, multiple people who tried to help, and a system that was supposed to protect him. Yet somehow all of these safeguards failed, and Gabriel paid the ultimate price. His story serves as a reminder that children are among our most vulnerable citizens, and that protecting them requires vigilance, courage, and action from all of us. Teachers, neighbors, family members, and social workers all have roles to play in ensuring that children like Gabriel are protected from harm. Today, Gabriel's case continues to be studied by child welfare professionals, law enforcement officers, and others who work to protect children. His story has become a touchstone for understanding how systems can fail and what needs to be done to prevent similar tragedies. The reforms that were implemented following Gabriel's death have helped other children, though advocates argue that more work remains to be done. The case highlighted the need for better training, improved communication between agencies, and more thorough investigations of suspected abuse. Gabriel's memory lives on through the work of those who continue to advocate for child protection and through the reforms that were implemented in response to his death. While nothing can bring him back or undo his suffering, his story has meaning if it helps prevent other children from experiencing similar fates. As we reflect on Gabriel's story, we're reminded of the preciousness of childhood innocence and the responsibility we all share to protect it. Gabriel Fernandez was a little boy who loved to play, who had hopes and dreams, and who deserved so much more than the life he was given. His story is difficult to hear because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about child abuse and the systems that are supposed to prevent it. But it's important that we remember Gabriel not just as a victim, but as a child who was loved by his great-uncle and teachers, who showed resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity, and whose death sparked important changes that may save other children's lives. In the quiet moments when we think of Gabriel, we can honor his memory by committing ourselves to being the kind of adults who would have protected him, who would have listened to him, and who would have fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. Gabriel Fernandez's story reminds us that every child deserves safety, love, and protection. In remembering him, we commit ourselves to ensuring that his tragedy was not in vain, and that other children will be safer because his story was told and his life was remembered. Rest in peace, Gabriel. You were loved, you mattered, and you will not be forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.